So if you own an 04 to 14 two-wheel or four-wheel drive F-150 and you're looking for hands down one of the most affordable 3-inch leveling kits, you found it. MotoFab's 3-inch front and 2-inch rear leveling kit is currently the least expensive option available on the site at around the $100 price point, and that's for a pretty simple reason. We are retaining all of our factory suspension components. That makes this kit 10 times more affordable than a full pull suspension lift, and at around 3 inches of lift in the front, this is about the limit that I would go with your factory suspension components if you daily drive your truck. Anything higher than 3 inches in the front, I would consider a differential drop kit just to keep your CV angles in check, but at 3 inches, they're not too crazy, shouldn't be anything you have to worry about even if you drive your truck on a daily basis. Now, as far as the install goes, it is pretty involved. You are still pulling a lot of suspension components out, and you do have to tackle some crazy bolts and nuts with some specialty tools. So for that reason, I'm going to give the install a solid 3 out of 3 wrenches on my difficulty meter. The site says it'll take you maybe 2 to 3 hours, but honestly, if this is your first time doing something like this, it'll probably take you an honest day's worth of work. Now, leveling kits are cool because they get rid of that factory rake, they level out the truck, which I'm personally a fan of. I don't like the way the F-150 dips down in the front from the factory, and chances are, if you're watching this video, you probably agree with me. Now, as far as leveling the truck out, you can fit up to 33-inch tires with no rubbing issues whatsoever, as you can see from our shots there. Now, if you wanted to fit 35s, well, they might rub a little bit. It's nothing too crazy, surprisingly, and that was actually with a wheel that has a relatively neutral offset, which gives you a little bit of poke and it makes the rubbing a little bit worse. So if you went with a high positive offset wheel and 35s, you might have to do some basic trimming under there, but I wager you'd probably get them to fit just fine. Now, again, if you want one of the least expensive 3-inch leveling kits for your F-150, this is gonna be the one to go with. And if you decide to pull the trigger on this one, you can come back to this video in a little bit. I'm actually gonna show you guys all the tools you need to get the job done so you can be prepared, and then I'm actually gonna walk you through the entire install step by step. All right guys, to complete this install, you'll definitely be breaking out the entire toolbox. You'll need standard drive ratchets at a minimum with a metric socket set from 8mm up to 22mm. You might need a 27mm socket as well. Now the wrenches you'll need include a 13, 15, 17, 18, 21, or 13/16 in a pinch, and a 22mm wrench. You'll need a standard hammer. You'll also need an air hammer. And you will also need a 5/16 Allen head socket or Allen key. Now, optional but helpful tools include a pry bar, an impact gun, a cutoff wheel with safety glasses, channel locks or some sort of grips, some spray lubricant, an extension, a flathead screwdriver, and some impact swivel sockets. All right, so first we want to take some weight off of the end of our steering assembly, so we're going to be removing our caliper. Now to do that, you'll need a 14mm socket and a ratchet or an air gun if you're working with power tools like me. Then you want to hang this caliper up out of the way. Now we're going to get a little bit of slack in the lines here, so we're also going to be removing the bracket that secures the brake lines and the ABS line to the upper control arm. You'll need an 8mm and a 10mm socket for those. All right, once you got those bolts removed, you can pry your caliper off either with a flathead screwdriver or pry bar. And again, you want to hang it out of the way. We're going to be hanging it on the frame rail back here. All right, next we're going to loosen our tie rod end link here. You're going to use an 18mm socket to hold the nut, and you're actually going to be spinning the stud. You need an 8mm socket for this one. Now, if this gives you grief, you might want to use your impact gun and an 18mm socket to break that nut loose first. All right, now if you get to the point where you can't keep your 8mm socket on that stud anymore, you can actually come in here with channel locks. You can actually grab the rubber boot, give it a good squeeze. That should protect the threads, and then you can come in with an 18mm socket to finish the job. All right, our tie rod end is the same deal. You're going to be holding that nut with a 21mm wrench, and you're going to be spinning the stud with a 10mm socket. Now, if the stud doesn't want to spin free of the nut, you might have to break it loose with a 21mm socket, and then you can switch over to your wrench. Now, if you get lucky, it might just stay in place and you can just use the socket to pop it free. All right, next we're gonna loosen our lower shock bolts here. Those are 18mm nuts, so you'll need an 18mm socket. All right, next up is our upper ball joint here. It's the same deal as the tie rod end and the sway bar end link. You'll either need a 21mm socket to get the nut off if you're lucky and it stays in place, or you'll need a 21mm wrench and a 10mm socket to spin the stud. All right, now that we got that nut loosened from the stud on the ball joint, we're gonna separate it from the knuckle. So you're gonna be hitting the knuckle with a hammer. You should be wearing eye protection when you're doing this. All right, we're finally ready to remove our strut assembly. To do that, you're gonna be loosening the 3 nuts on the top here on those studs. You'll need a 15mm wrench for these. All right, to make removal of the strut and reassembly a little bit easier on ourselves, we're going to be loosening the lower control arm hardware here. You'll need a 27mm deep socket to loosen this nut. Now, we're not removing it entirely, we're just getting it a little bit freed up. All right, so our lower control arm is loosened. Our strut is technically free of the vehicle itself. It's just resting in there. Now we're gonna try and pull it free. Now, you might be lucky, you might be able to pull it out without having to do any extra work, in which case you're gonna be grabbing a big old pry bar. There's one easy way to go about this. You're gonna try and get the pry bar in between the bottom of the strut and inside of this little valley here in the lower control arm. Go ahead and pry up on the strut, and that should pop it out of here, and that should give you enough room to pull it out of the vehicle. Now, if that's a problem, if these lower bolts here are causing any issues, I'm going to show you guys how to remove those. Those are press fit bolts, but let's go ahead and try and pull it free with the bolts in place. All right, so unfortunately with both of these studs inside of the bottom of the shock, they don't clear the lower control arm even though we loosened everything. So it's pretty simple. We're actually gonna press these bolts out of here using an air hammer. They're splined, so they're just press fit into the bottom of the strut. What you're gonna do is you're gonna pop both of the nuts back on the end here. You wanna tighten down one completely to hold the strut to the lower control arm. Go ahead and put the nut just on the end of the bolt that you're gonna pop loose here. That's gonna make sure you don't mushroom the end of it so you can still thread this back on and off. Then you're gonna take your air hammer, or if you have a regular hammer, you're just gonna tap it out of the entire strut itself. All right, so we got one of those press fit bolts out of there. Now we went ahead and we threw another bolt and nut on this side and tightened it down. That way when we go to hammer out the other one, we're gonna keep our strut bolted to our lower control arm. That way when we hammer down on this other bolt, it's not just pressing the entire assembly out of the lower control arm. All right, so we got those spline studs out of there. We can finally pull the strut out of our truck. Now, again, you're gonna have a pry bar handy or a friend help you. Either way, you wanna get the lower control arm pressed down enough. That way the top of the strut can clear itself out of the housing. Same thing with the bottom, it can clear itself out of this little valley in the lower control arm. All right, we finally got our strut removed. We're ready to install our spacers up front. Now, in order to do that, you're gonna be grabbing these little Allen head bolts in the kit. These are gonna be acting as the new studs that secure the top of the strut to the truck itself. So you're gonna thread those through the pre-threaded holes in the spacer, and to tighten these down, you need a 5/16 Allen key or 5/16 Allen head socket. All right, once you got the studs on the spacer, you're gonna line the unthreaded holes on the spacer up with the original studs on the strut itself, and then you're gonna secure the spacer to the strut using the provided nylon locking nuts. You will need a 17mm deep socket to tighten these down. All right, with our spacer installed, we're almost ready to throw our strut back in place. However, when you throw the spacer in place, you're actually changing the orientation of the strut 180 degrees. And if you noticed earlier when we were removing it, these little eyelets here for the spline studs are actually at a bit of an angle. So now that this is actually flipped opposite direction as it was in the vehicle, the angle on these isn't too great as far as securing those spline studs in the lower control arm. So what we're gonna do, we're actually gonna take this over to a bench vise, we're gonna secure it, we're actually gonna use the strut as leverage, and we're gonna push it in the opposite direction. That way we're gonna change this eyelet so it's oriented at the same angle. That way when we put the strut on the lower control arm, both of those holes will line up nicely and we can get those spline studs back in there. All right, so like I said, you want to secure the eyelet on the bottom of the strut in a table vise like so. Make sure you got some cloth down so you're not messing it up too much. Get it nice and tight. And you're going to use the entire strut as leverage in order to orient the eyelets themselves. And now those will line up flush with the lower control arm. All right, so once you got those eyelets oriented in the correct direction, you can throw your strut in place. Now, we actually hopped over to our driver's side because we tried to fit our strut back in there, and even with the lower control arm loosened and everything separated as it sits, we ran into a little bit of an issue here, and that's simple. It's actually the axle itself preventing us from getting enough clearance. So what we're gonna do, we're gonna disconnect the axle from the hub. Now, in order to do that, you're gonna be popping off this little center cap right here. You'll need a flathead screwdriver and a hammer. All right, so once you got that cap removed, you can remove the nut here on the hub. You'll need a 13mm deep socket to remove that. But before you do, if you want to keep the rotor in place, it's helpful to have a lug on there on one of the studs. Keep that on the hub there. You're also going to be supporting the spindle with something like some bungee cord. Just go ahead and put it on the top here and then secure it to the top of the strut hat. All right, once you've removed that nut, go ahead and grab a hold of the steering assembly. You're gonna rotate it and the axle itself should fall out of the hub. That should give us enough clearance to get that strut inside of there, and we can bolt everything back together. All right, our axle is separated. We got the steering knuckle supported with that bungee there, so our lines aren't completely taken up there. They got a little bit of slack in them. Now we can finally throw our strut in place. Once we throw the strut in place, we're gonna line up all the studs in the top and get the nuts on there. Then we'll get those press fit bolts in the bottom. Once we got that all together in the upper and lower control arm, then we can throw our spindle back together with our axle. Okay, now we're gonna fit the spline bolts into the bottom of our strut through our lower control arm. You wanna get the splines lined up, and then you're gonna thread the nut on the bottom there of the stud. Then you can zip it down enough to seat the splines, and this should press itself together. You don't have to hammer down on these or anything like that. And again, to tighten these down, you'll need an 18mm deep socket. All right, so we have the top and bottom of our strut secure as far as hand tightening all that hardware goes. Now we're gonna lower our truck. We're gonna get some pressure on the lower control arm, raise that up a little bit. Then we're gonna reseat our axle assembly. Wanna make sure all these splines line up. Once you got everything pressed together, we can put the nut back here on the end, and then we can continue with buttoning everything else back up. All right, our axle is back together. We're starting to look like a truck again. What we're gonna do is we're gonna tighten down all the nuts on top of our strut there, make sure the strut is fully seated before we go any further. You'll need that 15mm wrench or socket to tighten these nuts down. All right, now we're gonna get our tie rod end seated in our knuckle, and we're gonna get our nut back in place on there. Again, you'll need a 21mm socket or wrench for this nut. And if it starts to spin on you, then you'll need that 10mm socket and that 21mm wrench. All right, now we're ready to get our upper ball joint into our knuckle. Now what you want to do is put some pressure on the lower control arm with the truck close to being on the ground. Obviously you want a floor jack under there, make sure it's nice and supported. Start to lift the lower control arm up until it doesn't have any more room to. You're just closing that gap between the hole in the knuckle and the stud itself. Once you've done that, you're going to line up everything like so, grab a pry bar, push down on the upper control arm to get the stud through, then grab your 21mm nut and hand tighten it in place just to keep the assembly together. Then we're going to tighten everything down and drive it home with the necessary tools. All right, now it's the same deal here. You might be able to tighten this down using that 21mm socket, but you might need that wrench and that 10mm instead. All right, next we're gonna secure our sway bar end again with that 18mm nylock nut that we loosened earlier. And again, if this guy spins on you, you can gently hold it with some pliers or some channel locks while you tighten this guy down. All right, once you get enough of the stud popping out there, you can put a 10mm socket on there, keep the wrench stationary, and you can continue tightening it down. All right, with our sway bar end link secure, we're gonna reinstall our caliper here. Again, you'll need those 14mm bolts and a 14mm socket. All right, now we're going to secure these two brackets that we removed in the beginning. You'll need an 8mm socket for this little ABS line, and you'll need a 10mm socket for the larger bolt for the actual brake line. All right, once you got your spacers installed up front, it's a good idea to double check everything that you tightened down because we did remove a lot of very important hardware. So go over everything twice, make sure everything's torqued to spec if needed. Make sure you tighten down those lower control arm bolts if you loosen them like we did. Once you double check that you got all that hardware tightened down, we can move to the rear. It's a similar process. You want to make sure the truck is in the air. You want to have the axle supported because we are going to have to drop it down gradually. We're going to be pulling the bolts and nuts for both of our shocks to disconnect them from the axle, and for that you'll need an 18mm wrench and a 15mm socket. All right, once you got both of those bolts and nuts out of both of the shocks, you're going to be pulling these nuts for our U-bolts. So we need a 21mm socket for these. Now you might have to spray these down because chances are they might be a little rusted or corroded. Now as you pull the last bolt, you want to hold this little guy here so he doesn't fall down. All right, once you pulled those 4 nuts, you can pull the U-bolts out. Make sure you pop this little ABS line and these plastic clips off first. All right, so once you got those U-bolts removed, now comes the fun part. You're gonna carefully lower the axle down just enough so you can pull those factory blocks out from underneath the leaf packs. Once you've done that, you're gonna throw the new block in place. You want the tapered end of the block facing towards the front of the vehicle, and there's gonna be little holes and little round pieces on the block itself that's gonna help it align with the axle and the leaf pack. You wanna make sure that those things are seated before you raise the axle back up so we can bolt down our shocks again. All right, once you got the new lift block in place, you're gonna be throwing on your new U-bolts as well as those new nuts and flat washers. Now the U-bolts on these are pretty long, so you might not be able to use a deep socket. They are 22mm nuts, so you'll need a 22mm wrench. What you're gonna do, you're gonna get both of these U-bolts in place, go ahead and fit all the hardware back on there, hand tighten them as close as you can, and then drive them home with that wrench. All right, once you got that hardware hand tightened on here a little bit of the ways and you've cleared some of the stud, you can make this a lot easier on yourself if you have a Sawzall or a cutoff wheel. These studs are obviously needlessly long, so we're actually gonna trim these studs up enough that we can get a deep socket on there. That way we can drive these home quickly and we make sure they're nice and tight. All right, so if you decided to make those cuts to those U-bolts like I did, you can go ahead and drive those nuts home with your deep socket or continuing tightening them down with your 22mm wrench. At any rate, once you get all four tightened down, we're gonna do the same thing to the other side, then we're gonna bolt up both of our shocks. All right, so once you got those lift blocks in the rear in place and you've tightened down your shocks, that'll wrap up the install. And that also wraps up my review of the MotoFab 3-inch front and 2-inch rear leveling kit fitting your 04 to 14 two-wheel drive or four-wheel drive F150. I'm Travis, thanks for watching, and for all things F150, keep it right here at AmericanTrucks.com.